The first body they found was not a whole body. It was a hand, pale against wet leaves, severed cleanly enough that the deputies staring down into the brush had to force themselves to keep looking for the rest. The discovery came in the summer of 1987 in isolated timberland outside Molalla, Oregon, where logging roads twisted into thick stands of fir and the ground stayed damp even when Portland baked. Searchers moved slowly, eyes fixed on ferns, fallen limbs, and pockets of shadow because the woods had already taught them a brutal lesson. If there was one set of remains out here, there could be more. For years, women had been vanishing on the margins of Portland and the surrounding towns. They were the women least likely to be searched for quickly: runaways, women struggling with addiction, women surviving day to day near street corners and cheap motels. Investigators would later say that vulnerability was part of the killer's method. He hunted people the system didn't protect well, then counted on time and distance to erase what he'd done. At first, the cases looked like separate tragedies: a missing person report here, a rumor there, a family member asking questions that couldn't be answered. But by 1987, detectives were no longer chasing a single disappearance. They were chasing a pattern. Tips began to center on the same stretch of forest. Hunters and people cutting through back roads talked about strange smells, disturbed ground, and items that didn't belong. When deputies pushed into the Molalla area timberland and found that first evidence, the case changed from missing persons to homicide, and it changed fast. The forest itself worked in the killer's favor. It was private land, quiet land that didn't see casual foot traffic. The access roads were the kind you could drive for miles and never pass another vehicle. In the wrong place, a scream would die in the trees and never reach a house. A person could disappear in minutes and not be found for weeks, if they were found at all. As search teams expanded outward, the discoveries multiplied. Remains that seemed at first like one crime scene became several. Detectives began documenting locations, measuring distances, and trying to understand how one person could return to the same area repeatedly without being seen. The answer, they believed, was confidence. Whoever did this knew the back roads. He knew where people didn't go. He knew how long it took for the woods to reclaim evidence. The medical examiner's findings pointed to sharp force violence. The condition of the remains suggested the killer had taken steps that would delay identification and complicate the work of matching bones to names. Each recovery required a new chain of procedures: securing the scene, photographing what little could be photographed, collecting items that might belong to the victim, and sending everything into the slow machinery of forensic comparison. While deputies searched the timberland, investigators in the Portland area began building a victim timeline. Who was last seen where? Which women shared the same neighborhoods? Which calls came in around the same times? The map that formed was grimly consistent. The victims were vulnerable, the disappearances clustered, and the likely point of contact was a man with a vehicle who could offer a ride, money, or protection. The man who fit that shape was Dayton Leroy Rogers. Born in 1953, living in the area, he did not present like a stranger passing through. He looked ordinary, working class, capable of conversation, the kind of person who could talk his way close. Prosecutors later argued that was part of how he operated. He approached women who needed something, promised what sounded plausible, then drove them away from witnesses. The break that brought him into custody came on August 7, 1987. That night, a young woman named Jennifer Lisa Smith ended up in Rogers' truck in a parking lot in Oak Grove in unincorporated Clackamas County. She was stabbed repeatedly, and her death became the last confirmed murder that juries would later convict him for. The details of that attack put investigators on a direct path to Rogers. At the same moment, the Molalla discoveries were escalating. Once Rogers was identified as a suspect, investigators began pulling everything they could: his movements, his contacts, what he drove, what he carried, where he spent time. They compared the known facts of Smith's case with the emerging patterns from the forest. Similarities mattered: the type of victim, the geography, the way the violence was carried out. The case tightened, not because of one dramatic confession, but because of accumulation, each piece of evidence stacking on the next until the story of what had happened in those woods could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. The Molalla dump site became the anchor point. 6 women's remains were found there, left in a place the killer assumed would stay quiet, far from streetlights, far from patrol cars, far from anyone who might recognize what was missing. The forest was used again and again, and that repetition told detectives the killer felt safe returning. In court, the names made the pattern brutally real. Rogers was convicted of first-degree murder in 7 counts. Jennifer Lisa Smith, Lisa Marie Mock, Maureen Ann Hodges, Christine Lotus Adams, Cynthia DeVore, Nondas, Noni Cervantes, and Riatha Giles. Years later, authorities identified an 8th victim, Tanya Jerry Johnson, and tied her to the same cluster of killings. The convictions came in 1988 and 1989, and Rogers received death sentences that would be fought over for decades as Oregon's courts revisited the law and the rules around aggravating factors and sentencing. Time passed. Appeals moved. Courts ordered resentencings. But the underlying record did not change. Multiple juries concluded the same man had targeted women who were easy to overlook and discarded them in the woods as if they were debris. Long after the trials, the case still carried a second kind of damage: what it revealed about who gets protected. The women Rogers targeted were not unknown. They had friends. Some had family members still searching. They had people who remembered their laughter, their tempers, their habits, their small dreams. The problem was that for too long, their disappearances did not trigger the kind of immediate, organized urgency that might have interrupted the pattern earlier. For the detectives and searchers who walked the Molalla timberland, the memories stayed physical: the wet brush on their sleeves, the smell of earth turned over, the moment a flashlight beam landed on something that shouldn't be there. Each discovery forced them to do 2 impossible things at once: treat a human life as evidence, and treat evidence with enough care to speak for the dead. Rogers became known as the Molalla Forest killer because of where so many victims were found. But the real story lived in the space between Portland's streets and those silent woods. The rides offered, the trust exploited, the turn off the main road, and the way a predator could keep moving through a city while his victims vanished into trees no one wanted to search. Thank you for listening to Homicide Files. Subscribe for more true crime stories.